Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank you for attending this year's Current Science Knowledge in Support of Popular Science Writing Symposium Conference presented by American Public University System. The title of this presentation is The Diamond Anniversary of Silent Spring, subtitled, Rachel Carson Teaches Us How to Remain Relevant at 60. This presentation was created as part of EVSP 498, the Senior Seminar in Environmental Science. The instructor for this course is Dr. Valerie Titus, and the presenter is Jason Sullivan. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring is widely regarded as the metaphorical spark that would ignite the environmental movement. For anyone born after 1970, the thought of the United States without the EPA, OSHA, or really any environmental regulation at all is almost inconceivable. Concern for the environment is ubiquitous in today's society and pervades our daily lives from occupation to legislation and even to pop culture. For those of you who may not be familiar with Silent Spring, Carson spends several chapters describing the development of pesticides. Pesticides referring to a wide array of chemicals used to kill any living and undesirable creature includes insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, and rodenticides. Written in 1962, Carson was focusing specifically on the widespread use of synthetic pesticides, many of which were conceived during the chemical warfare research conducted during World War I and II. While naturally occurring pesticides had been used for centuries before that, the significance of synthetic pesticides was their potency as well as their persistence. Combined with their widespread use, the synthetic organophosphate pesticides like malathion and parathion, as well as organochlorines such as cordane and DDT, became almost ubiquitous in nature. Measurable amounts were found in living tissue nearly everywhere scientists tested for it, including humans and infants. For those not fortunate enough to live in the Northeast, it is easy to forgive a certain ignorance relating to Carson's influence on the budding environmental movement of the 1960s. As a resident of York County, Maine myself, Carson's book was omnipresent in display windows and the bookshelves of friends and family members. We would even frequent the National Wildlife Refuge in Wells, Maine that bears her name. 2022 marks 60 years since the publication of Silent Spring. So, how has the information and context of Carson's thesis held up over the past 6 decades? Is the book still relevant? Or should it be regarded as merely a period-specific essay that no longer applies to modern society? Let's take a deep dive into the themes and warnings presented by Carson and see if this book should be mandatory reading or relegated to a footnote in historical context. The key themes of Silent Spring revolve around the widespread effects of synthetic pesticides used for plant and insect control. Beginning with World War I and carrying on through World War II, chemical weapons research led to the development of these synthetic pesticides, including organochlorines and organophosphates. Although pesticides had been used prior to this, they were organic in nature and included products like nicotine from tobacco and sulfur. Synthetic chemicals, however, were far more persistent, and their mechanisms of poisoning were little understood despite their widespread, indiscriminate application. At that moment in history, society found itself at a pivotal point: either adjust the methods of pest control, or continue the use of synthetic pesticides unabated, and suffer the consequences of poisoning the environment beyond restoration. The problem with the synthetic chemicals, as cited by Carson, were twofold. Not only were the pesticides persistent in nature, but they also failed to meet their desired effects. In Silent Spring, Carson provides example after example of these numerous failed attempts to control an insect, plant, or animal that people found undesirable for one reason or another. What they failed to account for, however, were the intricate relationships that balance populations of predators and prey, or pests and their natural enemies. Thus, the widespread dissemination of synthetic pesticides to control a nuisance plant or insect population often led to a resurgence of the nuisance species, negating any short-term benefit. Her argument, especially in this case, is that the end definitely does not justify the means. Chemical companies had, of course, tested these compounds for toxicity in animals in minute amounts that they thought reasonable exposure might entail, and found no noticeable effects. One of the interesting correlations made by Carson was that larger predatory animals had higher amounts of the chemicals stored in the cells, through a process known as bioaccumulation. The indiscriminate application of the chemicals led to their introduction into surface waters. There they were absorbed by algae and macroinvertebrates, which were consumed by small predators, which added to their own accumulation of the chemicals. This process continued throughout the food chain so that top-level predators stored chemicals in their tissues that were hundreds or even thousands of times higher than those deemed safe. DDT and the other pesticides are endocrine disruptors, meaning that they alter and disrupt hormones important to good health, especially reproductive health, as well as neurological and immune functions. Despite manufacturers' claims of safety, people were often harmed either directly or indirectly by these chemicals, causing both acute and chronic illnesses from organ failure, respiratory issues, seizures, and even cancer. Of course, admitting the danger would certainly affect profit margins and make manufacturers liable for damages, resulting in them denying any hazards and suppressing any damning research. Those in frequent contact with the chemicals were at the greatest risk, often leading to an unfortunate and early demise. But even those not involved in the application of the pesticides were in danger when windswept chemicals would result in accidental exposure. Carson instead advocates for natural alternatives of control and, when necessary, precise application of pesticides rather than indiscriminate and widespread use. She cites examples of invasive species being countered by the importation of their natural rivals or pathogens, rather than attempting control through chemical annihilation. Carson posits that society has deemed pesticides, to include herbicides, as safe because access to them is not readily restricted. Poisons sold on the shelves of supermarkets and hardware stores are available to consumers who may or may not be willing to familiarize themselves with warning labels. Exposure to the environment through overuse and overspray has been shown to be detrimental through the persistence of these synthetic pesticides. Carson's argument in Chapter 5, titled Realms of the Soil, relates the importance of understanding the science and hydrology of the soil, especially before indiscriminate or large-scale applications occur. The interactions between the minerals, microbes, macroinvertebrates, and plants are all deeply affected by the movement of water through the soil. Water contaminated with pesticides can put a stop to processes that are crucial to life within and above the earth. Carson further argues that the interruption of the natural balance within the soil can allow harmful organisms, previously held in check, to become a serious threat to humanity either directly or indirectly. The constant flow of nutrients within the soil and organisms allows for the transport of these persistent synthetic pesticides into plant tissues, including plants consumed by humans. Carson also points out that this is particularly concerning when contaminated vegetables are used for baby food. Infants and children are more vulnerable to the ingestion of toxins from both pesticides and herbicides than adults. Children eat more food per pound of body weight, and damage to their developing lungs, brain, nerves, and organs can be permanent. The validity of Carson's arguments was never really in question. A trained ecologist and marine biologist, her credentials were more than adequate, and her research was thorough. Shortly after the publication of Silent Spring, due to massive manufacturer outcry, a follow-up study was conducted that analyzed bird populations in Hanover, New Hampshire, a town that had used DDT for many years in an attempt to control Dutch elm disease. Compared those with Norwich, Vermont, which had never been sprayed with DDT. Population surveys were conducted during the spring and summer following the application of DDT in 1963. As part of the survey, dead birds were collected in both towns and were analyzed for DDT as well as its isomers DDE and DDD. Severe mortality of both resident and migrant birds occurred in Hanover during the spring of 1963, and robin loss in particular was estimated at 70% of the resident population. Mortality among other species varied substantially, which the researchers attributed to feeding habits. The largest number of deaths were found among insectivorous birds. The study is kind of on the nose, admittedly, as it was published shortly after Silent Spring, and speaks directly to one of Carson's specific examples. Chapter 8, titled And No Birds Sing, refers to one of the greatest tragedies of widespread pesticide and insecticide use, the devastating impact on the avian population. Specifically, she speaks to the unintentional decimation of the robin population during the attempt to halt the progression of Dutch elm disease through spraying. This study reinforces that suspicion, and the researchers also went on to point out the irony of spraying to reduce the insect population, but instead unintentionally killing the natural predator of the pests. Similarly, Carson points out the futility of widespread spraying when most populations of American elms still experience high rates of destruction anyway. Carson begins her book by describing an idyllic small town where all life lived in harmony with its surroundings. The beauty of the place is quickly decimated by a strange blight that destroys the natural order and brings a foreboding silence. The blight is the townspeople themselves, and although the town is fictional, it represents a very possible future. 60 years later, have we avoided this dystopian outcome, or have we fallen victim to our own inventions and hubris? Fortunately, DDT has been banned in the United States and throughout most of the rest of the world. However, this does not mean that other synthetic substances have not taken their place as a threat to the environment, nor that we fully understand the processes and interactions of chemicals we continue to use today. Although climate change was barely a blip on the radar in the early 1960s when Carson published Silent Spring, many of the themes in her book translate to this modern existential crisis. Carson saw and provided evidence for the detrimental anthropological effects of synthetic pesticides and wanted to halt the progression of this trend before the results became irreversible. Similarly, the goal of analyzing global environmental change is to analyze the anthropological effects of the planet's various ecosystems and provide predictions about the future impacts on the Earth as well as our society. When considering climate change, most immediately think of carbon emissions from burning fossil fuels as the primary contributor. And it is. However, the agricultural sector, especially livestock, is also a significant contributor. Because of this, there are now several movements seeking to adjust agriculture and land management systems away from conventional, chemical-intensive practices to sustainable, organic approaches. As Carson points out in Chapter 5, Realms of the Soil, this thin layer spread over the surface of the land impacts the existence of all life on Earth through complex and often little understood processes. Conventional agriculture currently supplies the majority of the world's food supply. A 2019 IPCC report estimates that it alone is contributing approximately 25 to 30% of the total greenhouse gas emissions worldwide. Furthermore, much of the agricultural GHG emissions are linked to industrial systems of crop production and the rise of factory farm systems of animal production. According to the US EPA, the top 3 agricultural contributors to greenhouse gas emissions over the last decades were soil management, enteric fermentation from ruminant animal digestion, and manure management. Much as Carson pointed out, the detriment of synthetic pesticides being applied to the soil, either directly or indirectly, the use of synthetic fertilizers, petrochemicals derived from fossil fuels, is considered a significant contributor to the rising planetary temperature due to their emissions of nitrous oxides, a potent greenhouse gas that also feeds the development of ozone. In addition, runoff from synthetic fertilizers contaminates water bodies and contributes to eutrophication. Soil carbon sequestration has also been found to be compromised by the use of synthetic fertilizers, further exacerbating the problem. Healthy soil, on the other hand, can absorb and store 1,000 pounds of carbon per acre-foot of soil annually, equivalent to 3,500 pounds of carbon dioxide per acre drawn down from the air and sequestered into organic matter in soil. In addition, healthy soil can make landscapes and crops more resilient, buffering them from some impacts of the warming climate, for example, flooding and drought, and supporting healthier ecosystems in both the soil and the surrounding ecosphere. Organic regenerative practices that support soil health and carbon capacity include use of cover crops and compost, reduced tillage of the soil, interplanting, crop rotation, and avoidance of monocropping large parcels, shifting some production to perennial crops, and others. Perfluorooctanoic acid, or PFOA, is a synthetic compound that is part of a group of chemicals known as per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS. PFOAs do not occur naturally, but have been manufactured and used in a variety of industries around the globe, including the United States since the 1940s. These PFCs, or perfluorochemicals, are used to make polymer coatings and products that resist heat, oil, stains, grease, and water. PFOA was used primarily for manufacturing polytetrafluoroethylene, or PTFE, usually known by its brand name of Teflon. Although PFAS, including PFOA and PFOS, have been phased out of production here in the United States, they are persistent, meaning they do not break down in the environment and they will be present for years to come. Like DDT, these substances are bioaccumulative, meaning they literally accumulate faster than they break down, and are extremely resistant to environmental degradation processes, and thus persist indefinitely. Products manufactured years ago still expose people to these contaminants. When PFAS-containing products are discarded, they will likely end up in a landfill, which is generally how these chemicals enter the soil and water supply. However, PFOAs differ from those of other well-known persistent and bioaccumulative organic pollutants such as dioxins and pesticides like DDT. DDT is generally not significant as drinking water contaminant because it has a high affinity for sediments and low water solubility. In contrast, PFOA, as well as some other PFCs, are distinctive as persistent and bioaccumulative organic compounds that are known to be important drinking water contaminants, as they are highly water soluble. Drinking water can be an important source of exposure, as it is persistent in humans, with a half-life of several years, but it accumulates primarily in the serum, liver, and kidney rather than in fat, which is typical of other contaminants. The EPA has established a lifetime health advisory, or LHA, of 70 parts per trillion for PFAS. That's a number that's almost inconceivably minute for most people to comprehend, especially when we typically talk about most chemical exposures being measured in just parts per million. The study of PFOA health effects on the human population is a relatively new field. The human health effects from exposure to low environmental levels of PFOAs are unknown. PFOA can remain in the body for long periods of time. In laboratory animals administered large amounts, PFOA can affect growth and development, reproduction, and injure the liver. More research is needed to assess the human health effects of exposure to PFOAs. Most of the work done thus far has been through epidemiological studies of the general population and those in contaminated communities. Of particular note, mortality associated with acute exposure has not been reported, but that's where the good news ends. Although epidemiology can rarely establish causality, it can determine statistical significance. In the case of PFAS, the most consistent findings from human epidemiology studies are increased cholesterol levels among exposed populations, with more limited findings related to infant birth weights, effects on the immune system, cancer, and thyroid hormone disruption. The true dangers of PFOA contamination have just recently come to light, and research continues today. The EPA even formed a council on PFAS on April 27, 2021, that was created in order to better understand and ultimately reduce the potential risks caused by these chemicals. Thus, for both DDT and PFAS, we have seen that we have established a history of applying chemicals en masse without understanding the consequences. It makes me wonder what chemicals we handle and use every day without realizing they are slowly accumulating in our bodies, the effects of which may not be realized for years or even decades to come, when it is too late to make a meaningful difference. Although people can make valiant efforts to eliminate synthetic chemicals from their daily lives, the truth is that these chemicals are ubiquitous, and no one can truly be free of them. The possibility can extend to electromagnetic radiation from modern technology, and emissions from internal combustion engines. No one can really say what effects or combined effects all of these may be having on our bodies, and on the environment as a whole. If we have gleaned nothing else from Rachel Carson and her magnum opus Silent Spring, it is to beware of man's hubris, for his control of nature is but an illusion. That concludes the presentation. I would like to thank you all for attending and for your undivided attention.